watching the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. Now, in the heat and dust of elections, people often forget the issues that really matter. A lot of political discourse becomes about he said, she said. But in the midst of all of this noise, are we overlooking a serious challenge that India could be facing? Is India moving towards a slowdown? Are we seeing the signs in lower demand for cars and two-wheelers, or the slump that the real estate sector finds itself in the fact that Hindustan Unilever posted the lowest volume growth in 18 months and its chief says even FMCG is not recession-proof? Meanwhile, industrial output is in the negative zone, the lowest in 21 months. Even the Ministry of Finance in its monthly report has warned that the economy is slowing down in 2018-19. So are we in trouble? And if so, why? To speak on this, I am joined today by Swaminathan Iyer, consulting editor at ET Now, Sadanand Dhume, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm also speaking with Arvind Singhal, chairman and MD at Technopack, and Maithili Bhusramuth, consulting editor, ET Now as well. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for speaking with us. Let me start with Swami. And what you make of the conversation we've been seeing, the debate we've really been seeing in op-ed pages largely. But is it hitting home? Are we heading towards a patch of trouble, and how deep does it look?
Without doubt, the world economy is slowing and India is slowing along with it. It is not that, it's just something that's happening in India, not happening elsewhere. There are forces pulling things down everywhere in the world. The most prominent, obviously, right now is if you're seeing this trade spat between China and the USA. People thought it was going to be patched up together. It has not got patched up. We are getting rising protectionism, rising internal-looking stuff the world over in a large number of places. And this cannot be good for global integration or for India's growth. We, on top of that, I think, have some particular problems of our own. And yet, there is a difference between India as seen from New Delhi and as seen from the USA. Seen from the USA, even while India is slowing, I mean, we may be down to 6.6% in the last quarter. I wouldn't be surprised if we are unable to do much faster than that in this current financial year. The projections of 7.5% growth, I wouldn't be surprised if it comes down to 6.5%, the way things are going. But even at 6.5%, seen from Washington, India would be perhaps the fastest growing major economy in the world. In other words, India is not doing too badly in relative terms, even if we are not doing well in absolute terms. So the problems that we have been with us sometime internally. We are unable to pull away and do a Chinese miracle. But we are still chugging along at a reasonable rate. We have a number of problems that we are not quite sure how to fix or whether we are going to fix it. And there are, because of all kinds of fancy spending promises made in this particular election campaign, there is going to be a serious fiscal issue that faces the next government as and when it comes. Nevertheless, I would say that we can be cautiously optimistic that while we have many problems, by global standards, we are not doing too badly.
I'm going to take away a key term you used there, Swami, which was relative. Relative to what? Looking at it from Washington's perspective, you're saying it's not too bad. If you look at it from what India could have done or should be doing, maybe the view may change. It's open to debate. Let me get Sadanand Dhume in on this. And also the backdrop of this conversation is that we're in the middle of the heat and dust of elections, where economy may have taken the backstage as a campaign slogan, but it is one of the bases on which voters are going to judge the current government that's up for re-election.
So, Tamanna, let me start with one sort of big point, which is fairly obvious, which is that for the next government, this is obviously going to be the single most immediate pressing issue. There is a slowdown going on, and they're going to have to address it. Unlike Swami, I am not cautiously optimistic. I mean, his point about, Indian growth rates being relatively high compared to many other major economies is, of course, correct. But that is also partly a function of India's extremely low per capita income. Obviously, we expect India to be growing faster at this stage. And if you wanted to go by way of comparison, if you want to compare how fast India is growing today compared to how China was growing when it was at a similar level of per capita income, it certainly looks a lot less impressive. My concern really is that now, as we kind of head into the next government, we would have seen 3 consecutive governments that have really not been able to tackle some of these policy issues that people have been talking about, for well over 20 years. So now we've had 2 terms of UPA and 1 term of NDA where there's been no real progress on labor reform. We've had similarly now 3 terms, 2 different parties, no real progress on privatization, right? What they've been doing is selling from one hand and buying with the other. Similarly, some of these land issues seem untractable. So the question for me watching this is that at what point do we have to accept that the political economy of India is not geared to deliver that reform agenda that many of us have been talking about for a long time? And if the political economy of India is not able to offer that reform agenda, then what are the implications for India in the medium term and the long term?
Well, we need to look at it from the political economy point of view, because this government was also voted in on the promise of Vikas. There were high hopes from reforms. Some measures have taken place. Let me come to Maithili on the next question, and also from the perspective of what we've been hearing from Ratan Roy, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and a statement he made about India possibly moving towards the middle income trap made huge headlines. Now, you spoke with him last week. What's the sense that you got, Maithili?
Well, if I could just address the question that Sadanand raised, that the political economy of India does not allow reform. I would disagree with that slightly, to saying that it is not that it does not allow reform. It allows for reform at a much slower pace than in the case of China. The political system in China allows the government to do what it wants when it wants. In India, it is simply not possible. Even with a majority government, you really have to carry people along. So that necessarily slows things down. So I would agree with Swami that there is case to be cautiously optimistic. And on Ratan Roy's point that we are moving towards a middle economy trap, if that were really so, I would be very happy, because the fact is that we are still largely a low income economy. We are really not anywhere near where we should be. So your point, Tamanna, that you raise, that even though the Indian economy is doing relatively well, is it close to our potential? No. Is it as fast as we need to grow? No. So that is what the next government will have to address. How do we ensure that we live up to our potential? Even if the potential rate of growth is only 8% and not the double-digit number that we were talking about not so long ago, even at how do we reach that 8%? So that, I think, really is a challenge for the government. And one last point, the growth that we are likely to achieve in this current fiscal of 7% is despite a quite tight monetary as well as fiscal policy. Once these levers are loosened, and we're already seeing monetary policy loosen, I think we will be able to achieve a higher rate of growth. Remember, we now have the highest rate of real interest rate that we've seen for a long time. When the real interest rate is close to 4%, you're not going to get much investment or much consumption demand. Hopefully that will change. If we vote for a stable government, we find a stable government with a single party or coalition, political stability is very important for economic growth.
Let me, before I come to Arvind Singhal, let me come back to Sadanand for a response to some of the points Maithili and Swami made as well. Do you think that even while we look at what the challenges for the next government, this is a time, looking at all of the indicators and the high frequency indicators we're seeing, to question why? Why do we find ourselves in a situation like that, and can we hark back to some of the policies we've seen over the last 5 years to look at some of those reasons?
So, I mean, Maithili's point is well taken. I mean, obviously the Indian political economy is very different from China's, and the pace is going to be slower. But the question is, how much slower, and how much of that can India afford? Right, there is this jobs crisis. India needs to create 1 million jobs a month for people entering the workforce. If year after year after year, the system does not, it's slow because of the reasons that we've all talked about. But at what point does that slowness begin to have larger social and political consequences? And I think that's still an open question. But you can see, you know, agitations having broken out over the last couple of years, and sort of whether you look at the Marathas, whether you look at the Jats and others. So I tend to sort of, you know, think that we don't have this unlimited luxury of kind of, you know, tinkering and going slowly and taking everyone along, which of course is just built into the system. So the question is, if we're not able to grow at say 8%, forget double digit, and if this is going to be sort of this 6.5%, and even here some of the numbers are a little bit debated because of the new way of calculating GDP growth, then I really wonder, you know, I mean, how long can this go on? If for 15 years some of these policies are not pushed through. So let's just say we get another term of some government and it's not really able to grapple with these issues because it's difficult, then we're basically into a territory where for 20 years we would have been talking about some of this and we haven't been able to do it. Now perhaps technology evolves in a certain way, perhaps the world environment evolves in a certain way, and maybe India does get away with it. But I think at this point it's reasonable for us to begin to ask questions about what are the consequences if the reform agenda does not get back on track.
And was there any reason for it not to have been on track? I want to come to Arvind Singhal specifically on the consumption slump. And a huge trigger for all of these conversations over the last few days has been the consumption slump. We've seen that in vehicles, in motor vehicles. We've seen that in the FMCG space. We know there's a problem in the real estate space. The IIP numbers, we've seen industrial output contract. So don't all of these indicators point to a serious problem?
So Tamanna, I agree that there is a problem. How serious the problem is something which could be debated. Let me try to put a different perspective on consumption. Firstly, absolutely no doubt that some of the sectors which are especially dependent upon availability of finance, and two-wheelers and four-wheelers certainly fall into those categories, are hugely stressed. The availability of finance has been really very, very poor. It was bad enough even before demonetization, and demonetization put actually a kind of a death blow on availability of financing, especially through NBFCs. So two-wheeler and four-wheelers basically are probably struggling more than other categories of private consumptions. I do not necessarily agree that there is a big slowdown in consumption of FMCG products. It is my personal view, no disrespect to Hindustan Unilever, but they are not necessarily a bellwether to show that how the private consumption in FMCG is doing there. Not today, but maybe some other time. I can identify companies which are very small companies, turnovers of 100, 200, 500 crores, some of them starting ups in the last 4 or 5 years. They all seem to be growing at a fairly good clip, and therefore my hypothesis is that some of the older players, ITC, Hindustan Unilever, Godrej Consumer Products, are beginning to see an effect of a new kind of a competition which is chipping away some part of the growth which normally would have come to them. The other aspect of consumption we need to be very, very careful about. Over the last 15, 20 odd years, Indian consumers tend to be spending a bit more of the available income on services, relatively less on merchandise. We need to look into consumption holistically. Now, some services which are picking up a disproportionate amount of consumer interest and therefore consumer spending. One is the broader category of what you would call as education, which also includes coaching. The total number which middle class India is spending on coaching as well as private education, it's almost 1,60,000 crores. It's a significant number when you look into the overall consumption basket, comparable to personal care and body care size of the FMCG. Huge growth there. When you look into leisure, entertainment, travel, last year we did about 1 billion trips domestically. I don't have data in absolute numbers, but significant amount of consumer spending has shifted towards that area. Look into even categories within merchandise. The spending on mobile phones, consumer electronics, consumer durables seems to be fairly robust there. So let us not necessarily draw conclusion from one part of the consumption economy and then extend that same conclusion to all other aspects of consumption, we need to look into consumption holistically. So there is some stress for sure. The new government has to be cognizant that economy has to be given some kind of a stimulus as and when the next budget is presented. But I would not necessarily think it's all doom at this point in time.
Swami, what's your take on what Arvind Singhal is saying, that Hindustan Unilever is not the only consumption story? Just as an aside, if people are spending more on coaching classes, it's also a statement on the state of education in our country. But that's of course an aside. Do you think that that's a fair point, that there's not enough to tell us that there is a serious consumption slowdown, though of course there are indicators beyond HUL results?
For me?
Yes, Swami, that's for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I would say, the thing that nobody has really mentioned right now, the issue is not just goods, the issue is not services. There are a number of things. There is no country in the world that ever did a sustained 7% export growth. So did a 7% GDP growth without having export growth of at least 15%. This is one thing that in India right now we are not having. And that is the one big missing part of the picture. If you go back to the 2000s, our exports were galloping upwards in some years by 20% plus. That is what helped us to grow at 9% in terms of GDP. If you ask me, the greatest particular problem right now is, why is it that exports are stagnant for so long? In the year that just passed, I think we had 7-8% export growth. But that came after a long period of stagnation, and we have barely had any export growth above the 2013-2014 level. In some ways, I would say it's utterly remarkable that we managed to get 7% growth with stagnant exports. No other country in the world has ever managed to achieve that. And to there, I would say that, we have some advantages. We have the advantages that different states of India are as large as countries in other places of the world. And therefore, I think intra-state trade, the gains of trade between states, have managed to give us some of the same advantages that in small economies are only possible in international trade. I think that's what's managed to keep us going so far. It still seems unsustainable to me. Unless we can pick up exports in a very substantial manner, I would say our 7% export growth is in real danger. Why is the export growth so poor? The number of people are looking around for explanations. It's not very clear. Some will say that the exchange rate is the major culprit. Others, including Maithili, will say that one of the culprits is very high input prices, including interest costs. Our real interest costs are really high. Of course, the land acquisition thing has also made the cost of land especially high. And our various labor laws have made our labor costs fairly high. So if you have high land costs, high labor costs, and high capital costs, answer is, will you have thriving exports? And the answer is probably not. We need to have a fix on all those. And overarching all of those, frankly, is the fiscal issue. If you take not just the central fiscal deficit, but the state's fiscal deficit and the borrowings of all the public sector undertakings, the totality is something called the public sector borrowing requirement. That has been estimated at 8.5% of GDP, which is almost as much as the entire tax revenue of the central government of India. So, we need to get our fiscal discipline under control. If you do not, that is going to be one factor that is going to keep interest rates higher and higher and is going to come in the way of our reviving and having sustained fast growth.
You spoke about the need for a stable government to ensure that we're on the mend. Haven't we had a stable government with an overwhelming majority for the last 5 years? What do you look at as the prime reason for the situation we find ourselves in? I think there's a broad consensus on this panel that there is an issue. Let's come to the whys. And Arvind Singhal seemed to suggest that some of the problem may be because of a move like demonetization. Do you agree with that?
Is that addressed to me, Tamanna?
Yes, Maithili.
Yeah, well, see, if you look at our macro indicators, broadly there are just 3 or 4 macro indicators that give you a measure of the health of the economy. One is the fiscal deficit, about the internal balance, the current account deficit is external balance, and inflation, GDP growth. So if you look at inflation, the inflation has been well below even the RBI's 4% mark. It's in the range of 3 to 4%. So on inflation, the past 5 years have seen a phenomenal success. Current account deficit has been more or less under control. It's not as healthy as one would expect it to be, but not near the danger mark of 2.5. GDP growth on an average of 7.5 plus, not bad at all. If you look at all, the only worry perhaps is on the fiscal deficit. There again, the union government fiscal deficit is the average of about 3.5. Add together that of the states and you look at the overall public sector borrowing, as Swami says, it is quite high, but nowhere alarmingly so. Total debt to GDP ratio is in the range of 60 to 70%. So broad macro indicators indicate reasonable health. Has there been a slowdown? Is there a slowdown? Yes, there definitely are signs of a slowdown. Part of the reason for this, as I said, is because monetary policy under the previous RBI governor and his predecessor, both Raghuram Rajan and Urjit Patel, was excessively tight in a bid to get inflation under control. So today we are paying the price for excessively tight monetary policy, which did help us win the war against inflation, but we paid the price in terms of GDP growth. So that is part of the reason. Another reason perhaps is the government's determination to adhere to fiscal discipline. It has not entirely succeeded, but as compared to the UPA's record on fiscal discipline, the NDA's discipline has been far better. So tight monetary policy, tight fiscal policy, together we are seeing slowdown. And of course, the two big bloomers, one was GST, one was demonetization. GST was not a bloomer, GST was a necessary reform, but we have paid the price in terms of temporary disruption of economic activity. Demonetization was a terrible bloomer, a needless, we shot ourselves in the foot. So today the slowdown we are seeing is a combination of demonetization and the necessary reform of GST, which will necessarily disrupt economic activity, but hopefully there will be long-term rewards. So yes, is there a slowdown? Yes, there is a slowdown, but nothing to get panicky about.
Okay, let's see what solutions, so to speak, are on offer. Let me come to Sadanand Dhume right now, because we've spoken now in this conversation about re-energizing the economy post the elections. Now, the Congress is offering a Nyay kind of framework which they claim will remonetize the economy. On the NDA side, they've got a PM Kisan scheme. So it's a mix of income support with some amount of farm loan waiver as well put in place. Do you see any concrete plan from future policy makers and current politicians on how they will fix this situation?
So let me get to that, but let me first come back to this this idea of a stable government being necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if anything, what the past 5 years tells us is that a stable government may or may not push through reforms, but it's also a kind of large, stable single party government that can sometimes do really spectacularly stupid things like demonetization. I can't imagine any coalition government shooting itself in the foot with something as dramatically stupid as demonetization. So that's just sort of one point. Let me sort of park that over there. Now, if you look at it in terms of what the Congress is trying to do with Nyay, and then sort of more modest offers along similar lines by the BJP, this really returns to the point I started with, which is that we have two separate conversations going on. Right? We have a parallel conversation. One is the conversation of experts, technocrats, pundits, people like Maithili and Swami and so on. And then you have the conversation that the politicians are having with the voters. Now, traditionally since 1991, India has found a way to find a kind of middle path between these two. So the politicians go and say one set of things to the voters, and then the technocrats have or the experts, they have a say, they have a voice in the policy making process, and somehow we eke out reforms. My worry is that this gap, instead of closing over time, is only opening. And there's no better example than Nyay. Now, which sane politician or political party would come up with something like Nyay when we are having this conversation about the fiscal deficit, particularly if you combine the central and state fiscal deficit together, being a real concern? So what the politicians are really, Nyay is a classic example of that, but there's some examples on the BJP side too, though I would consider the BJP has been more responsible on this front. It's about fiscal profligacy. So to win votes, you want fiscal profligacy. but to put the economy back on track, you need fiscal discipline. And I think that this sort of, this tension of course is nothing new. It's always been there. But in my reckoning, this is a tension that is deepening rather than lessening.
Mr. Singhal, let me come to you on what's on offer in terms of what politicians are saying and what the next government needs to do.
See, I think that I would discount a little bit in the heat of elections. Politicians do tend to make wild promises. I'm reasonably optimistic that whichever government comes to power after 23rd of May would certainly be taking a slightly more serious, more balanced view about what is feasible, what is not feasible. I don't think any of our political classes, or for that matter bureaucrats, are so indisciplined that they can allow the economy to be taken to the cleaners because of some irresponsible promises made in the heat of the election there. So I personally feel that the next budget in July, when it is presented, will give us some indication in terms of what kind of a reformist agenda the new government would have in its place. We certainly need reforms for sure. We certainly need, in my opinion, and Mathili made this point very eloquently, I think the Reserve Bank of India has actually played, in my opinion, a rather sad role in the last 5 or 6 years, focusing largely on a single indicator of inflation control at the cost of growth. I'm sure that the government would realize that the economy needs some kind of financial stimulus. We need just more money in the market there. That is one kind of a reform I'm hoping on the policy side the new government will make, irrespective of which government comes in there. I think government spending has been under a lot of stress. I hope that some of the projects on the capital side of spending will finally begin to see the a momentum once again, which has slowed down in the last 6 months there. So 2 areas, government spending to increase and fiscal policy to become a little bit more benign, are 2 immediate areas I think any government can take some action on when they come to power.
That's true, but right now all we know is from what they have promised. And Swami, do you see any clear plan on either side of the aisle, so to speak? Because look at the focus of the NDA as well. It's speaking about PM Kisan or speaking about farm loan waivers, and those are political compulsions at times. At the other side, you have Nyay with a claim that will kickstart and remonetize the economy. So do you see a clear plan to fix the problems that have easily been identified?
I would disagree with the idea that the government giving out a large amount of cash can revive the economy, because the government has no cash of its own except what it takes out of your pocket and my pocket. So at the end of it all, aggregate demand will not increase if you have a large amount of government freebies going out. Secondly, I have seen that, our political economy is such that our politicians tend to make promises that will bust you. Then the actual implementation of it, they manage to fiddle in various ways so that in fact the fiscal impact is not. The farm loan waiver that the Congress party said it's going to do, Amarinder Singh in Punjab, after 2 years, apparently the farm loan waiver is being done in such small steps so that it may take a full 5 years for it to be fully given out. And because of that, the impact on the state finances is less than it is otherwise. So I would say in various ways, people will try and find ways of fiddling what is to be done. The danger is going to be if you have a seriously hung parliament with a very, very wide range of political parties, regional parties especially, which have the ability to pull the government down. You might then get demands for a large amount of regional sums of money from various places. You'll find Andhra Pradesh and Telangana in particular, they're going to support anybody who says, you give me special category status. I'm not sure what that means in the new thing, because we abolished special category status. But if those 2 states are going to be seen getting something more, some other states are going to demand very much more as well. So I would say, that is that new area of populism, not yet there in all the election promises, which can be a particular problem. I would simply say that, overall, at the end of it all, I do not think the political economy of India is such that spending will go out of control. There will be some modest increase. I also do not think that merely government giving out certain sums of money by itself increases aggregate demand. Just like the pay commission award came, a large amount of money supposedly went out. It didn't really give a boost to the economy because, as I said, the only government money that it had for paying the thing was a result of taking money away from other sectors of the economy. Yeah. Aggregate demand did not increase. So ultimately, we cannot do fast growth merely by having a little spending spree here, little spending spree there. We have to increase the efficiency of our investments. We have to get more bang for buck. Many of the reforms that Sadanand referred to are things that we will need to do. That ultimately is the only sustainable source of faster growth.
Maithili, last word to you. You've said, yes, there is a problem. Consumption is dropping. What are the solutions that you see in sight that the next government must focus on?
Unfortunately, Tamanna, there is no magic bullet. It is a slow, painful process of constantly chipping away at reforms, trying to do whatever is possible within the political economy that India offers. At the same time, the good news is that there are signs that investment is picking up. The Reserve Bank of India reports that capacity utilization is increased. We are now functioning near full capacity, which is defined roughly between 75 to 80%. Combined with that, the latest GDP numbers do show some improvement on investment. Once investment picks up in a big way, that is private investment, then government investment can take a step back and we will find, government's fiscal deficit come down. There will be increased availability of funds for the private sector. Hopefully that day will not be long off. We are right now waiting for the 23rd to see what signs we get. As I said, if we get any kind of a stable government coalition or not, it doesn't matter. Then I think the economy will pick up steam once again and you will see us cross that 7% or even 7.5% in the current fiscal 19-20.
Absolutely. I want to thank all of you for joining us in the debate today. So are we heading towards some rough weather? Yes. Will it be something persistent? Perhaps not. Maybe the resilience of the Indian economy will show itself up once again. Thank you so much for watching.